record. Now, we talk about the fossils, the original material being fully dissolved away. Just as an aside note, a study that was done taking a look at the femurs, this is the leg bone of a T-Rex, where they cut through the thickest part of the femur, and they were able to find that there is actually some evidence of original material that was left behind. So here we've got examples of connective tissue, and in fact this is a protein called collagen, and they were able to actually recover some of this from the thigh bones of T-Rex. And so this is not going to, we can actually compare that to the collagen of animals alive today and see that T-Rex is closely related to the birds. Now, we're not able to clone dinosaur from this, or a T-Rex, because DNA is fairly fragile in terms of a molecule, and we've not yet been able to recover DNA from fossil remains. So I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing. I'll let you think about that. Another type of fossilization that can occur is a process called carbonization. So here is a leaf that fell into some silt, and what we have here is the carbon from the leaf left behind. So the leaf started to decay, and some of these are so exquisitely well preserved that you can still see the veins left behind in these leaves. So this is actually left behind from the carbon left in the leaf. Again, we wouldn't have original material left behind. Here. Now, occasionally we can find original material from living organisms, which is fossils. So here we take a look at baby mammoth that died on the tundra and was frozen in ice. So that is the original body of that baby mammoth. Occasionally in areas like Siberia, we can find remains of mammoths and the such frozen in ice. Here is a mammoth that was excavated from the ice, and as the researchers were getting close to the mammoth's body, as is frozen in ice, they could actually smell what the mammoth would have smelled like. They could recover pollen that was present from the plants alive alongside of the mammoth and the like. Here's where they have started to thaw out the specimen, and there are actually some research teams that are looking to see if this animal has been frozen since it died. Some of the DNA cells, the nuclei of the cells, may be intact, and it may be possible to clone the mammoth, which is certainly another discussion on its own as to whether we should clone a mammoth. So we'll save that for perhaps another discussion. Now, when we look at fossils, we can also have molds and casts left behind. So a mold is an impression, kind of like if you go to the dentist and you have a mold done of your mouth. Okay, so here we have a trilobite that left a mold, that's the impression left behind. Here we have a mold of footprints left behind. The negative of that mold, if that mold is filled in, it leaves the what's called a cast. So as we look at dinosaur footprints, these are very helpful because we can not only learn things about whether the organism moved in alone, solitary, or in groups. We can also infer how fast it was moving and how much it weighed by knowing that. So in these would form by a dinosaur walking through, say, a drying riverbed. So this would be a clay riverbed, and then that would fill in with that clay would harden, and then you'd have sediment forming above that surface. Now, it's important for us to realize that the fossil record is incomplete. So we don't have this beautiful laid out record of all of the organisms that have ever lived, and that we do indeed have gaps in the fossil record. So it's important for us to realize that, first off, we have these gaps because fossilization is indeed a rare event. most organisms that died will not be petrified or fossilized in any way. But that really doesn't diminish the value of the fossil record. So even though we have gaps in the fossil record, we still have the big picture. And that big picture tells us how life changed over the history of the Earth. And one of the great benefits of the fossil record is it shows us transitional forms. So when we talk about transitional forms, these are going to be organisms that are intermediate between two major groups. So one example we might look at is what is that intermediate between a fish and an amphibian? So there's a big step there from an animal that lives in the water with fins to an animal that has legs and breathes air. I think you'd agree that that is quite a big transition. And so as we looked at this, we started to find fossils that had these transitional characteristics. So one of those first fossils that we found that was transitional was an organism known as called Eusthenopteron, which had these fleshy lobed fins. So we've got these bones in the fins. Within the last 10 years, some researchers found a even more transitional specimen, that being an organism called Tiktaalik. This was found up in northern Canada. And what's really critical in this is if we look at the front fin, we see that these bones that were present in that front fin form a joint. We have one bone, followed by two bones, followed by bunches of little bones. And this is critical when we start to take a look at the development of limbs of land vertebrates. So these are the animals with backbones. When we look at limbs of amphibians, reptiles, birds, mammals, and the like, we see that all of their limbs really do follow this same pattern. One bone, so that would be your humerus. Then you have your radius and ulna, and then you've got your wrist and hand bones present. That layout of bones that we see in not only our arms, but also the legs of land vertebrates was really established early on with this ancient ancestor. And what evolution has done is organisms have adapted for whether it's crawling, grasping, or flying, or swimming in the case of the whales, is it has adapted those bones to that purpose. So this is the layout that we see in the limbs of land vertebrates. One bone, two bones, bunches of little bones. And Tiktaalik is a beautiful example of a transitional specimen. We could take a look at Archaeopteryx as another example here. This was discovered actually shortly after Darwin published on the origin of species, and this is a beautiful transition from reptile to a bird. So it has many reptile-type characteristics. So it's going to have a long bony tail. It has claws on its arms. Also, you can't see it, but it has teeth. But it also clearly has bird-like characteristics, the presence of feathers and wings. So a beautiful transitional specimen showing this shifting from one way of life to another. Some really interesting work. So here, if you've seen the Jurassic Park movies, you're probably familiar with Velociraptor. A researcher who was studying Velociraptor was actually studying the ulnas of Velociraptor. So this would be the bone right here in the forearm. It runs from your wrist down to your elbow, kind of from your pinky actually, down to your elbow. And when they were looking closely at this bone, they could see that there are these little nubs, little bulges on the bone at regularly spaced intervals. And by knowing anatomy of animals alive today, they had seen this before on the wings of birds. So wings of birds also have these little nubs that are present. And what are those nubs indicative of? Those are the sites of feather attachment, indicating that Velociraptor most likely was not covered in the scaly hide, but Velociraptor had feathers. And certainly this makes sense, as the birds are really the last surviving members of the dinosaurs. This does raise an interesting question. Well, what about T-Rex? T-Rex was along the same lineage as the Velociraptor. So did T-Rex have feathers? Well, our best bet is that a baby T-Rex probably had feathers very similar to a small chick. So if you might see a small chicken, after they hatch, they're soft and fuzzy. Those feathers are well adapted to helping to retain body heat. And so we'd see that T-Rex young probably had those same types of feathers. And in fact, our best guess information at this point is that an adult T-Rex probably also had feathers to some degree. We're not sure how much of their body was covered in feathers, but certainly there were likely to be some feathers covering their body. So it's important for us to realize that our scientific view of life is constantly changing as we gain more information. Now, next session, we're going to continue on talking about our evidences for evolution, and I hope you'll join me then.